If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place-based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Welcome to the Tennessee History Nerd. This is a podcast dedicated to Tennessee's past. Every week we bring you a new story about the people, places, and events that have shaped Tennessee and made it, and us, who and what we are. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable place, and sit back and enjoy. Tennessee is a big state. Not Texas, California, or Alaska big, but to drive from Johnson City to Memphis, that's about a 500-mile drive. So when we're talking about comprehensively covering the stories of the state, it's a big task. It helps to take it in bite-sized chunks, and one way is a county at a time. So, as promised when we began the podcast, we're going to do that. We're going to drive across the state, one county at a time. And frankly, the easiest and probably most ecumenical way to do that is to take the counties alphabetically. And thus, in this County Spotlight number 4, we're driving across Bledsoe County and looking at its story this week. So make sure you've got your sunglasses on, your drink in the cup holder, and your seatbelt fastened. We're on the road, and we're headed into Bledsoe County, Tennessee. The Sequatchie River forms itself in Cumberland County near Crossville and flows generally southwest for 116 miles until it reaches the Tennessee River near South Pittsburgh in the upper reaches of Guntersville Lake. Along that way, it travels through the breathtaking Sequatchie Valley, passing through Bledsoe, Sequatchie, and Marion counties. The valley is located between two imposing ridgelines that run roughly southwest to northeast. Near the top of the valley lies Bledsoe County. Formed in 1807 from parts of Roane County and Cherokee lands acquired through one of the Tellico treaties of the early 1800s, and named for Revolutionary War soldier Anthony Bledsoe. Bledsoe County originally encompassed some of the area now included in Cumberland and Sequatchie counties. Both of these latter counties were formed from parts of Bledsoe as well as other counties in the mid-1850s. While modern roads have made travel into Bledsoe County to be much easier than it used to be, it's still rugged country. And Tennessee Highway 30 coming into Pikeville from Dayton to the east and headed to Spencer, once you leave the valley, is a steep and winding mountain road with a number of switchbacks. The same is true for US 127 headed northward toward Crossville. Only US 127 headed southward toward Dunlap down through the valley is mostly straight and level road. That's important to understand because those mountains have had a great deal to do with Bledsoe County's history. Things like the Trail of Tears, moonshine running, and the Swofford-Tollett feud. Speaking of the Trail of Tears, when the U.S. Army forced the removal of the Cherokees into Indian Territory, its primary route through the area more or less mirrored the stage route, what today is Tennessee Route 30. There evidently were some alternate routes used as well, but the primary route was most east to west along the basic path of Highway 30. If you've ever driven that route, you know how rugged the terrain is. That had to be a difficult journey under the best of circumstances. Obviously, the Trail of Tears was not the best of circumstances. Those who follow my other podcast, Dauphin Island Diaries, may be familiar with a recent episode that I did for that show on the ghost town at the top of the bay, about the old town of Blakely. It turns out that there are actually 2 ghost towns at least in Bledsoe County, and like Blakely, One of those used to be a county seat. Not long after the formation of the county in 1811, some of the early settlers of the area established the town of Madison, which was the first county seat. Madison's location was about 6 miles north of what is today Dunlap. However, just a few years later, by 1816, a man by the name of Charles Love provided land for a town site that was more centrally located and, perhaps more importantly, was on the stage route. That town would become Pikeville, and within a couple of years after its establishment, the county seat would be moved from Madison to Pikeville. Over time, Madison would fade as a business. Over time, Madison would fade as business and the economic center shifted to Pikeville, and the old county seat would fade into a rural community. Interestingly, no one seems to know for certain exactly how the town of Pikeville got its name. There are two possible theories. One holds that the town was named for Zebulon Pike. Now, Pike was an explorer and a soldier who was a contemporary of Lewis and Clark and the man for whom Pikes Peak in Colorado is named. The other theory is that it was named for Pike, North Carolina, said to have been where early Pikeville, Tennessee settler John Bridgman came from. But the town itself is on the site of a spring around which a village named Thurman's was located. The property that Charles Love sold for the town was on the Sequatchie Creek, also called Crow Creek, and was near Thurman's. That spring today still runs, and it's behind the Dr. James Ross house. It served as the principal water source for the town until about 1920. Today it's public land and is an outdoor recreational site. If you walk around the town, there are both historic buildings and the ghosts of other structures that are no longer there. Among the earliest structures in the town that still remain today is the John Bridgman House. As already noted, Bridgman is the source for one of the possible stories for the name of Pikeville, but he also built the federal-style house on the north side of the square across from the courthouse in about 1815. I don't know if it's the oldest surviving structure in Pikeville or not, but if it isn't, it is a title contender. As of 2026, when I'm sharing this, it's 211 years old this year. It survived the Civil War, the modernization movements over the years, and even the fire that claimed the second courthouse in 1908. Its survival is even more remarkable when you consider that directly to the west of the Bridgman House, on the northwest corner of the square where the First Farmers and Commercial Bank is today, is where the old Story Hotel used to stand. It was built as a near contemporary of the Bridgman House, probably in the mid-1820s, and was originally known as the Sequatchie Hotel, but later called the Story Hotel. It was built by Dr. Samuel Story. If your idea of a good weekend includes a fishing rod, a boat, a campsite, and a Tennessee sunset over the water, then you need to check out Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. Located on scenic Kentucky Lake on the beautiful Tennessee River, just 9 miles off Interstate 40 at exit 133, Birdsong is conveniently located halfway between Memphis and Nashville. Family owned and welcoming guests since 1961, Birdsong is now operated by the second generation of the Keast family, and whether you're looking for cabins, full-service RV sites, primitive tent camping, boat rentals, boat sales, fuel, bait, or easy lake access, Birdsong has you covered. Be sure to visit the Tennessee River Freshwater Pearl Museum, where you'll find Tennessee's official state gem, the freshwater pearl, and learn how the freshwater pearl industry brought worldwide attention to this part of Tennessee. To start planning your getaway, visit birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. That's birdsong.com or call 731-584-7880. Birdsong Resort, Marina, and Campground. I think you'll be glad you went. And when you call, tell them Big John sent you. It operated into the 20th century, by that time called the Ferguson Hotel. In June 1862, Union forces under General Ebenezer Dumont crossed the mountains from McMinnville to attack the Confederate force holding Pikeville. The Confederates were very disorganized and retreated in confusion when the Union cavalry charged their position. Of the 600 Confederates, 142 were taken prisoner, while the Union troops suffered no casualties. Subsequently, they commandeered and ransacked the Story Hotel and destroyed many of the hotel furnishings before withdrawing and returning to Murfreesboro. The Story Hotel stood until the early 1970s when it was demolished. I've not been able to determine when it last served as a functioning hotel, but for over 150 years, it occupied that corner of the square. One can only imagine if, instead of being destroyed, its historic value had been recognized and somehow it had been preserved. It could be a museum and a showpiece today, similar to the Chester Inn in Jonesboro. Small towns like Pikeville today, with revitalization programs, are striving to restore and preserve historic structures like others in downtown. But unfortunately, the story of the Story Hotel came to an end before such efforts at preservation became the trend. And speaking of the Civil War, like a lot of other East Tennessee counties, Bledsoe leaned heavily towards supporting the Union by a nearly 3-1 margin in the June 1861 secession referendum. The voting was 500 to 197 against secession in Bledsoe County, which is almost 72% in favor of remaining in the Union. Ironically, in spite of the Union's sympathy in the county, more men from Bledsoe were said to have served in the Confederate forces than in the Union forces. Like much of Tennessee, the story wasn't nearly as simple as North versus South. Those mountains didn't just shape roads and moonshine routes. They also shaped loyalties. Communities were relatively isolated, kinship networks were strong, and political allegiances could vary from one hollow to the next. East Tennessee wasn't politically monolithic, and Bledsoe County is a good reminder of that. In fact, that was part of the origin of the famous Bledsoe County feud. We'll talk more on that shortly. Meanwhile, like a lot of Tennessee, the Sequatchie Valley, including Bledsoe County, had a sizable amount of traffic for both armies, especially in 1862 and 1863. The Union forces in the June 1862 raid under Dumont didn't stay after they'd done their damage and taken their prisoners. About 2 months later, Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Mississippi drove northward through the valley in 1862's Kentucky campaign. During the time that Bragg briefly occupied Pikeville, the Bledsoe County Courthouse, the original courthouse, was used as a hospital by the Confederates. In June 1863, Union troops occupied the town again, and this time never relinquished control again for the duration of the war. A few years after the war, another well-known structure in Pikeville was built. On the east side of the square on Frazier Street, Dr. James A. Ross built his 2-story Victorian-style home in 1875. He also built a small office building behind his house that served as his clinic. After his death, other doctors purchased his home and turned it into the town's hospital and infirmary. It served in this capacity until the hospital was built on Main Street. Today, the old Ross House is a museum and serves as the home of the Bledsoe County Historical Society. And the courthouse itself, not the first or even the second, but historic anyway. The first courthouse, the original, built in the 1820s, was replaced sometime in the late 1800s. That second courthouse burned in 1908. The current courthouse, one might say the new courthouse, was built in 1909 to replace the one that burned. So even the new one is 117 years old. That's historic in its own right. One aspect of historic preservation in Bledsoe County that is particularly encouraging is that the old AME Zion Chapel is not only still standing, it's still being used. Built on the east bank of the Sequatchie River during Reconstruction in about 1870, it was also used as a school building, including as the Freedmen's Bureau School in the area, until 1925 when the Lincoln School was built. It's believed to be the oldest existing African American church building in Tennessee. Also still standing, though not really in use now, is the old Lincoln Consolidated Rosenwald School. Julius Rosenwald, president of Sears and Roebuck in the early 1900s, was a wealthy philanthropist and benefactor. Booker T. Washington, a black leader in the early 1900s, collaborated with Rosenwald to build over 5,000 school buildings throughout the South for African American children to have access to an education. The Lincoln Consolidated Rosenwald School is an example of this type of construction. Built about 1925, it served as a school for the African American children of the community until Bledsoe County schools were integrated in 1965. Currently, as best as I can tell, the Lincoln School building is still in good shape overall, but as far as I can tell, it isn't regularly being used for anything. Buildings not regularly used tend to deteriorate more quickly than buildings that are being regularly used. Ideally, I would say that letting the Lincoln Schoolhouse become a museum that provides something like interpretive exhibits of the African American experience in the area from emancipation forward would be an appropriate way to honor the benevolence of Julius Rosenwald and the memory of the children who were educated at Lincoln, as well as those who never had that opportunity. About 10 miles southwest of Pikeville on US 127, you can find the Lusk community. It wasn't always known as Lusk, and it used to be a pretty busy place. In the early 1900s, it was the home of the Atpontley coal mine, and there was a small bustling town that existed there while it operated by that same name. The name itself is a compound of three coal miners, Atkinson, DuPont, and Finley. If you enjoy the stories we tell each week and would like to show your support, I'd like to invite you to check out the Summers Media Enterprises merchandise store. You'll find shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, and other items featuring both the Tennessee History Nerd and Dauphin Island Diaries. This month's featured item is one of my personal favorites, our I Break for Historical Markers bumper stickers. Whether you're the kind of person who can't drive past a historical marker without pulling over, or you simply appreciate a good piece of history, it's a fun way to let everyone know you're always on the lookout for the next great story. To browse the entire collection, just visit the link in the show notes or visit the Summers Media Enterprises website. Every purchase helps to support the work that goes into researching, producing, and sharing these stories each week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our podcasts. And now let's get back into the story. There was a spur railroad line that ran from the mine and the town. The coal was carried to the Dunlap coke ovens in Sequatchie County. An incline railway connected the town to the mines on Fredonia Mountain. Now the tipple is gone, as are pretty much all the buildings from the original mining operation. To my knowledge, very little is left to show that a company mining town once existed there. It, like Madison before it, is another ghost town in Bledsoe County. In a lot of places around the South where there was a substantial population supporting both sides in the Civil War, the end of the war did not immediately close the wounds of hostility and hard feelings that had erupted during the war. And to some degree, those hard feelings weren't just from being on opposite sides. Partisan activity, whether organized or not, resulted in hatred between families. In Bledsoe, that drove a long-running family feud between two of the families that had been in Bledsoe from the earliest days, the Swaffords and the Tollets. It's believed that the feud began in about 1863. The Tollets leaned Confederate, and the Swaffords had Union sympathies. It was believed that John Tollet Jr., a wealthy landowner in the valley, had a large amount of cash either on him or hidden close by. On April 30th, 1863, Tollet and a visitor at his home known as Old Man Monday were murdered by renegades seeking that cash. The victims were first tortured to cause them to reveal where the cash was, and then killed in the process. One of the gang of renegades was believed to have been Aaron Swafford. Among the more notorious events in the feud was the Election Day shooting on November 8, 1892. Both families had determined to secure the vote of Jesse Swafford for their preferred candidate. He was related to both families, and the Swaffords supported the Republicans while the Tollets were Democrats. The Swaffords, from what I can tell from the accounts I've read, more or less kidnapped Jesse Swafford from the Tollet territory the night before the election and got to town first on Election Day. As they left the polls, the Tollets, armed and spoiling for a fight, came riding into town. By the time the shooting stopped, Aaron A. Swafford and his son James were dead. John and Bill Swafford had also been shot, as well as their nephew Goliah. A bystander by the name of Jim Walker also had been hit. Mose Tollet was the only Tollet injured. He was stabbed multiple times by one of the Swaffords in a vain attempt at defense. Another death in the feud occurred in 1905 when one of the 1892 survivors, William Bill Tollet, was shot down by a Swafford nephew. The nephew was accused of forging checks on Tollet's bank account. This would perpetuate the feud even further. On October 11th, 1932, Sheriff Thomas Swafford was ambushed and killed while sitting in a vehicle in front of a store he owned. Two men shot him from across the street as he spoke with two of his deputies. One of the rounds hit his spine. The men who shot him fled the scene. He died the next day. His wife inside the store was also wounded in the shooting. It was believed that this was also tied to the feud. Whether it was the Swafford-Tollet feud or other family feuds of which I'm unaware, former district attorney for Bledsoe County, Michael Taylor, said that the local blood feuds continued on into the late 1970s. One of the descendants of the Swafford family, also named Thomas Swafford, became an author and historian and wrote a book on the feud that's available for purchase in several locations in Pikeville. Unfortunately, as I discovered to my disappointment when I was in Pikeville recently, the places I found that sold the book did so only on a cash basis. As I didn't have sufficient cash on hand and they didn't accept credit cards, I don't yet own a copy of this book, and so I'm unable to add more to the account of this feud at this point. But it may serve as an interesting standalone episode topic at some point in the future. At any rate, this feud was one aspect of Bledsoe County's history that led to it achieving the sobriquet of Bloody Bledsoe. But it wasn't the only reason for the county's infamous nickname. Rocky Top, one of the state songs of Tennessee, was written in 1967 by Felice and Boudleaux Bryant. It was made famous originally by the Osborne brothers and now is played frequently by the University of Tennessee Pride of the Southland Band at every football game. While Rocky Top is also now the name of a town in Anderson County, formerly known as Lake City, the second verse of the song, to me, is quite reminiscent of late 19th and early 20th century Bledsoe County. Once two strangers climbed old Rocky Top, looking for a moonshine still. Strangers ain't come down from Rocky Top, reckon they never will. Corn won't grow at all on Rocky Top, dirt's too rocky by far. That's why all the folks on Rocky Top get their corn from a jar. Moonshine production was almost big business at one time in the mountains and ridges of Bledsoe County. Moonshiners recognized the advantages of the abundant water sources throughout the valley, and this provided a very important ingredient in moonshine production. In 1920, there was what was known as the Whiskey War. 9 men went to war over illegal liquor. 6 were wounded in the shooting, and another subsequently died. Wars were fought between moonshiners and lawmen. Moonshine making and running was a way of life during this time, as were attempts by lawmen to control it. Prohibition in the 1920s only made it worse. In the early 1900s, the illegal bootleg moonshiners operated almost as moonshine mafia. Some moonshiners attempted to control the local moonshine trade. Some syndicate operators extorted money from independent moonshiners and ensured that their competition was arrested, or worse, if they failed to pay the protection money. Among the most notorious bootleggers in the area was Church Lester, who was known as the Moonshine Man. He was also involved in mafia-style operations in his role in the local illegal liquor industry. Known to be dangerous as well as charismatic, he was implicated in a dynamite attack in which 3 children were killed. Sentenced to be executed in the electric chair, he committed suicide before the sentence could be carried out. Incidentally, another of the men implicated in the same crime and also sentenced to die was White Miller Tollett. These whiskey wars also contributed to the Bloody Bledsoe reputation. They contributed to the body count. Historian Thomas Swafford, mentioned earlier, discovered well over 200 incidents of homicides and deadly assaults between 1861 and the late 1950s. Many of these deaths were tied directly to the moonshine running operations and the violence involved with them. An interesting phenomenon that comes up repeatedly when the violence and killing of these years is researched and when those cases went to trial is just how frequently people who were obviously guilty of the crime of which they were accused went free. Not on technicalities, not on lack of evidence, acquitted. What seems to be the case in a large number of these murder trials is something called jury nullification. The defendant is found not guilty because, as is colloquially said of the deceased, he needed killing. In other words, even if the case didn't meet the fairly narrow definition of justifiable homicide, self-defense, defense of others, etc., the jury determined that the murder committed was justified because the victim needed to die. In the article, The Lynching of James Scales, How the FBI, the DOJ, and state authorities whitewashed racial violence in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, by Andrew P. Cohen, it's noted that, quote, of the 211 confirmed killings by Bledsoe men between 1861 and 1950, only 21% of the perpetrators served any jail time in Bledsoe County, and none were sentenced to death, end quote. That's just over 1 in 5. 1 in 5 confirmed killers served time. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story. Cohen goes on to say, quote, an attorney who practiced in the county during the mid-1900s explained with chilling clarity that Bledsoe juries let so many killers walk free because, quote, we take into consideration whether or not the person who was killed needed to be killed, end quote. But if there was one singular episode that cemented Bledsoe's reputation and legacy as Bloody Bledsoe, it was the lynching of James Scales. Because there was a fairly small black population in Bledsoe, and because of the nature of the types of violence, the vast majority of the Bloody Bledsoe killings had been the result of white-on-white violence. The lynching of James Scales was different. James Scales was imprisoned at what was to become known as Taft Youth Development Center. Founded as the state vocational training school for boys, it was also called the Pikeville School for colored boys. All of these names euphemistically hide the true intent of the institution. It was a reform school, and in the Jim Crow years, it was a reform school for blacks. Students were inmates. It was a prison for those not old enough to be imprisoned with adults. On November 23, 1944, guards at the facility had accused 16-year-old James Scales of brutally killing the wife and daughter of the school superintendent. A mob gathered to hang Scales under a large tree. Before that was completed, someone in the crowd shot Scales in the head multiple times. The double murder and lynching of a black youth became a national news story almost overnight, which is remarkable given that World War II was raging at that time. Governor Prentice Cooper offered a $500 reward for information leading to the capture and conviction of the killers. The U.S. Department of Justice instructed the FBI to investigate. But in spite of all that was said and done initially, no one was ever indicted or prosecuted, probably because there was a war on. And just a short time later, the Battle of the Bulge began in Europe and everyone's attention shifted elsewhere. But what that means also is that Scales' murder was never investigated, and neither were the murders of the superintendent's wife and daughter, because both were presumed to have been done by Scales. Regardless of why it happened, or even if Scales truly were guilty of the crime for which he was lynched, he didn't get his day in court. He didn't get the opportunity to prove his innocence if he actually was. The mob violence invoked the he needed killing defense before he was even tried. If you travel to Bledsoe County today, some things haven't changed. The roads are still curvy and bending back on themselves. You still descend about 1,000 feet into the Sequatchie Valley from the northwest or east, and to leave, you climb about 1,000 feet. The terrain is still rugged and still beautiful. If you go looking for Bloody Bledsoe, I'd say that if you look hard enough, you can probably still find some remnants of it around somewhere. But nowadays, Bledsoe's pretty quiet. Nowadays, Pikeville doesn't even have a single traffic light, though it did at one time. And based upon some of the comments I've seen on this topic, many of the residents think that a strategically placed stoplight could be warranted. But others I talk to, they like it that it's small enough not to have a stoplight now. Some folks want the neon and the traffic and the bustle, and others want the peace and quiet. And to borrow from the Cheers theme, to be where everybody knows your name. Downtown now, instead of looking for opportunities to remove places the way the Story Hotel was, the city planners are looking for ways to preserve the rich history of the town. Pikeville, like many other small towns, has engaged in a revitalization program that has beautified the downtown area, made it much more inviting, and has placed historic markers around the area that correspond to a walking tour to provide interpretive context to the historic structures that remain. And there are other structures and other things that are of historic interest in Bledsoe County that I haven't covered. In any survey of a county, there are going to be things that are omitted in the interest of brevity. For example, I haven't even mentioned Fall Creek Falls until this very moment. It straddles the county line of Van Buren and Bledsoe. As such, it could have been included in the drive across Bledsoe County, and it is a story that will be told, just not today and not now. There are houses and people that I haven't mentioned. That makes them no less important. It's simply a matter of editorial license on the part of the storyteller to craft the story. Bledsoe County is beautiful, rugged in many places. But when you come down off that mountain, you pick which one and look out over the valley. The view is breathtaking. Maybe Bloody Bledsoe in the past. I'd like to think that it sheds some of that now. Maybe now it's closer to blessed Bledsoe. Maybe. And that's going to do it for this episode as we've been driving across Tennessee, the Bledsoe County edition. I hope you've enjoyed our journey, and I hope you'll join us next week when we head over to McMinn County to check out the 1946 Battle of Athens, when a group of local World War II vets fought back against the corruption of the local political machine. We're coming up on the 80-year anniversary of that event. I'd already planned to do an episode on it this season, but that realization made it even more of an imperative. I hope you'll join us. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, the Tennessee history nerd, and I am history. Before we close things out, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the sources behind this episode. This story draws from a combination of local history, published research, and on-site interpretation. One of the principal sources for this episode was Bledsoe County's Best Stories by Ruth Sapp Burton, whose collection of local stories helped preserve many of the people, places, and events that make Bledsoe County unique. I also relied on Elizabeth Robnett's work as county historian, including numerous articles on TN Gen Web, the Tennessee Encyclopedia, materials from the Tennessee Historical Commission, along with local historical markers, museum exhibits, and interpretive materials gathered during my visit to Pikeville. In addition, several of the sources I consulted were themselves informed by Thomas V. Swafford's outstanding Bloody Bledsoe trilogy, Moonshine Man, The Life of Church Lester, Whiskey Wars, The Life of Jim Hamilton, and The Swafford-Tollett Feud. While I haven't had the opportunity to add those volumes to my own library, they're certainly on my list, and I look forward to studying them firsthand. As always, no single source tells the entire story. Whatever different accounts disagreed or details were uncertain, I compared multiple sources and did my best to present the most accurate picture possible. If you'd like to explore Bledsoe County's history for yourself, I highly recommend visiting Pikeville, touring the historic downtown, stopping by the Dr. James A. Ross House Museum, and picking up a copy of Bledsoe County's Best Stories. And if you're interested in diving deeper into some of the county's more dramatic chapters, Thomas V. Swafford's Bloody Bledsoe books are widely regarded as essential reading as well. As always, I'm profoundly thankful for the work that's been done by authors, journalists, historians, museum curators, archivists, and just plain folks who help to preserve these stories. I owe them all a debt of gratitude. And thank you so much for listening. Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening.